Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. First of all, let me say thank you for inviting me to this dedicated conference. It's so nice seeing you in person. So I have seen the participants of the research group many times on screen, but to see them live, at least most of them live, it's much better. I regret I missed the social events. I do apologize. Nowadays, it's particularly difficult to find the work-life balance. So this is the reason I missed the dinner yesterday and the dinner today. And I apologize, but soon after my presentation, I need to leave. But I wish you a very fruitful conversation. In my presentation, I focus on freedom of religion in pandemic times. As we see, we are in the middle of a pandemic and no one knows how long it lasts. We are witnessing measures, events, things we wouldn't have thought of 2 years ago. And my presentation is how it relates to freedom of religion. And first, I deal with the constitutional background of the state of emergency in general. And then I am examining if freedom of religion is any special, either from the perspective of the state and from the perspective of the believers. So the constitutional background of state of emergency. The present regulation on state of emergency roots of the former constitution of 1989 at the time of the transition. But you need to know that at that time the Red Army is still stationed in Hungary and no one knew if they intervened the transition or not. Therefore, the politicians were very cautious, were full of distrust of each other, and they wanted to stipulate very detailed, very rigorous regulations on state of emergency. I'm very glad that we hadn't had war since, because I don't know how they would work. But this is the first. We had some floods and some industrial disasters, but this pandemic is the first one we use state of emergency measures on the long run. Furthermore, to more complicate the situation, there is a linguistic gap. The internationally used state of emergency does not cover all special legal orders in Hungary. So every time we speak in English, we need to explain our situation. So it's overcomplicated. Now there is a constitutional amendment that will enter into force in 2 years that will ease the situation, but it's still complicated. Which is important that the previous constitution stipulated freedom of religion as a fundamental right that cannot be restricted even at the time of emergency. The present constitution, the fundamental law, has a different view. It does not mention freedom of religion. And the fundamental law says, just like the previous constitution, that fundamental rights, with a few exceptions, can be restricted or even suspended in emergency times, which literally would mean that you can simply suspend freedom of religion. You cannot go to churches, you cannot do any religious activity because the right is suspended. But there is an important decision of the Constitutional Court. Balázs Sándor delivered the opinion of the court, which said that despite the wording of the fundamental law, any restriction of a constitutional right, even in emergency times, must be in connection with the emergency itself. Which means that you cannot, the parliament or the government acting on behalf of the parliament cannot suspend the right just because it feels like to, but only in case if it has a close connection with the reason of the pandemic. So they are the features. Oh, I see that my slides moved on without touching this, but never mind. But I wanted to jump to this slide anyway. So what's the situation? Last year we saw that there were several emergency measures. There were state restrictions on many fields of life. It was not general in a sense that restrictions varied from occasion to occasion. So casinos were open while swimming pools were closed. So there was a distinction between the regulation. I've had some examples. In funerals, 50 people could be at present. Otherwise, for family gatherings, the maximum number was 10, excluding children, so 10 adults maximum. And there was a general ban on assemblies, no assemblies at all. And it was challenged at the Constitutional Court if such a distinction is constitutional, but the Constitutional Court replied that it was. So it didn't examine that there is a difference among the different occasions. I personally disagree with the decision of the court. I would say that coronavirus doesn't know what kind of occasion it was, so it can spread anyway. But that's my personal view. What is most important is that freedom of religion was not part of the restrictions by law. The government simply asked religious communities to consider the pandemic. So there was no ban. Religious communities, were free to decide how they limit their activities because of COVID, or if they limit their activities at all. Which meant that Protestants mostly went online, so bigger Protestant churches, Calvinists, Lutherans, went online. They had online services. But Catholics kept their churches open. They had masses. It would be interesting to see statistics if the virus spread better among Catholics than Protestants, but we don't have such statistics, obviously. But the key question for me as a scholar of constitutional law, why tiptoeing? Why isn't there a general ban on religious activities, or why isn't there a general limit on religious activities? Why is the state that cautious? Obviously, you can say that there's a big difference among congregations. There are communities of 15 people, and there are congregations of 500 people. And it is obviously, the bigger the congregation is, the more dangerous it is for the virus. But there's no such distinction on other parts. So somehow, freedom of religion is special. But before mentioning this, and before going to my point of why it is that special, it is not easy if to decide if a law, any state measure is religious or neutral. What do I mean? Last autumn, from November on, last year this time, Also in Hungary, like in many countries, we had a lockdown, and there was no possibilities to move certain places and so on. But this lockdown was eased for Christmas Eve. So Christmas Eve, everyone could visit their families. It was possible to attend the midnight mass, so either religious or non-religious activities were free to perform. Everyone was happy, and no one really considered it a religious issue, because Christmas is celebrated also by non-believers, and they also wanted to visit their families, and everyone was free to the same extent. But the very same regulation occurred in Georgia, but the suspension of the lockdown was on the day of the Orthodox Christmas, 7th of January, while there's a great minority of Roman Catholics and Protestants in Georgia. So what they saw that there was no possibility to go to church or visit families on the 24th of December, but they could on the 7th of January. The same restriction and the same suspension of a restriction became a religious issue because of the difference of religious homogeneity or heterogeneity of Hungary and Georgia. Or to tell you another example, in Chile, there was a regulation that only 5 people could attend baptism, which is practically impossible because 2 parents, 2 godparents, the pastor and the child, it's already 6. But if you happened to have a state celebration of the birth of your kid, the limit was 10 people. So it was more favorable to be non-religious than religious in Chile, which seemed to be a Catholic country. So what you see, it's very difficult to see, to define if a restriction is neutral or religious. Now to my key point. My motto is, you miss the most what you love the most. I have a good friend who, when there was a lockdown, he missed concerts. He loves concerts, and because of the pandemic, because of the lockdown, he couldn't go to concerts. Actually, I don't like concerts that much. But I love spas. I miss the sauna, the swimming pool, and so on. He didn't. I didn't really care of concerts. He didn't really care of sauna. We all miss the most what we love the most. Isn't the situation much the case of churches? If there are people who are non-religious, never perform any religious activity, never go to churches, they don't miss if churches go online or if they are closed or whatever. They don't really care. And some others who frequently go to churches, then they obviously miss. But still, I think it's not just the difference is much deeper. What is at stake? When governments introduce pandemic measures, they need to balance. On the one hand, there is a personal freedom to live our normal life, to do what we want. And on the other scale, on the other hand, there is a government's task to protect life and health. And you need to balance between the two values. But what is life to protect? The Greek language has 2 words for life. One is well known, which is bios. Bios refers to our physical life. Something which is mortal, or physical entities. But there is another word for life, which is zoe, or in certain English transliterations, it's zoe. And zoe refers to the permanent life. And the New Testament, especially John's Gospel, refers to zoe as something Christ gives us. Christ gives to the believers. And here is a big difference, that state restrictions can only protect, they can do nothing else but to protect bios. While freedom of religion as core is zoe. And there's a difference between the protection of bios and zoe. Obviously, religious people also find bios important. But you cannot risk zoe for bios. Therefore, freedom of religion is very special, because when we answer the question of what is at stake, the answer is different. So what is the good solution? Before turning to that, I need to add that there is a common misunderstanding on freedom of religion, and even in legal literature, many say that freedom of religion is to follow a traditional or non-traditional religion, to become or to not become a member of a church. But the situation is much the same, is pretty much different. The core of freedom of religion is conviction. As we read in the letter to Hebrews, that faith is the assurance of things hoped for, a conviction of things not seen. This conviction is the core element of freedom of religion, which means that it's not the question if I follow a church or not, but to have a religious conviction or not. So what is the general answer? How to balance? The states have general obligation to protect life, but besides, there's also a task to avoid the conflict between state regulation and personal conviction. And from the perspective of the believers, they need to accept also in pandemic times that our life is different, and they need to accommodate to state regulations, but there is a core not risking zoe for bios. Thank you very much for your attention.